Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing. All right.
Testing 1 2 3. Good evening.
I'll just, I guess, sit
hear a
right
single
here. Yeah, I think so. At least I was told that there might be. Yeah. Yeah, maybe during the Q&A I could bring it up or something. I'm good. Hi. Oh, hi. Lovely to meet you. Oh, yeah. Is that it's I haven't heard that as a Persian name before, but it's very nice to meet you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Okay. You can remember? All right. Well, if you remember, let me know. Well, I'd love to know what it is.
You want to give it a try?
Testing 1 2 3. Testing. For the love of God, David, come on. This is your one job. Testing 1 2 3.
Testing 1 2 3.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. We had some, there's always something. My name is Marcy Glass. I am the pastor and head of staff here at Calvary. We are glad to welcome you to our first event that we're doing with Book Passage. When I started the conversation with Karen West from Book Passage about bringing authors to speak here at Calvary, she asked me what kind of authors I wanted. And I said, people who are writing about things that are relevant to families in our world today, or people who are writing about religion, but not from a, I want to convert you or make you feel guilty kind of way. I said people like Reza Aslan, because I'd heard him speak when the God book came out a couple years ago. And she said, funny thing, we're looking for a place to host Reza Aslan. I'm like, yes! So here we are. So I'm very, very excited about this. As I mentioned, I read Zealot and I read God, two of his previous books, and I heard him speak when that God biography came out, and you are in for a treat this evening. I have also read this new book, which has just come out a couple weeks ago, and I highly recommend it. It is a very engrossing read, and whether you're Presbyterian or not, whether you have any relationship to missionaries or Iran or anything like that, this book asks questions that all of us need to be asking about how we value and order our lives. So Book Passage will be selling copies, signed copies of the book. He signed them earlier tonight out in the atrium if you did not get one before the event, so you can buy one after. We will also be passing out 3x5 cards tonight, so that if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you can write them down. We'll collect those, and then I'll lead a Q&A at the end of this. We will also be back here December 13th at 7 p.m. with author and Professor Carolyn Chen to discuss her book, Work, Pray, Code, about how relationships we have with work and with religion and with our cultural lives have all sort of blurred and merged, and what the implications of those changes are. So I hope you can come back in December, and if you signed in and gave us your email, we'll send you a reminder about that event as well. So it is my great honor to welcome Reza Aslan here at Calvary. He is a leading scholar in world religions. He's also a renowned writer and professor, an Emmy and Peabody-nominated producer, a recipient of the prestigious James Joyce Award, and the author of 3 internationally best-selling books. He's the host and executive producer of 2 original television programs and the co-host of a podcast called Metaphysical Milkshake. His degrees include a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from here in the Bay Area at Santa Clara, a Master in Theological Studies from Harvard University, and a PhD in the Sociology of Religions from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He also has a Master in Fine Arts from the University of Iowa, where he was a Truman Capote Fellow in Fiction. He's also a tenured Professor of Creative Writing at the University of California in Riverside. He was born in Iran, but lives in Los Angeles with his wife and their 4 children, and we are grateful that he has taken time away from them to be with us tonight, so please help me welcome Reza Aslan.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for coming out here to this beautiful church and this beautiful city. I've been on the road for a few weeks now, and it's slow going. People are still kind of a little bit wary about being out in public, and I'm a little wary about it myself, but it's really wonderful to be here and to be able to have this kind of one-on-one experience instead of like staring at everybody through a screen. So thank you. I'm very grateful for all of you to be here. And also, Blessed Diwali for anyone who celebrates today. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, we're here to talk about Iran, obviously. Let me make sure this thing works, if I'm doing it right. There we go. And of course, we're here having this conversation in the midst of an uprising unlike anything that I've ever seen take place in Iran. And I actually lived through a revolution in 1979. Most of you know that for the last 5-6 weeks or so, people have been pouring out onto the streets of Iran calling for an end to the murderous, illegitimate regime that has ruled over that country for the last 4.5 decades or so. Actually, these protests have been going on for quite some time now. For the past 6-7 months, there have been sporadic protests around Iran where you have farmers and factory workers, school teachers, retirees who have been protesting the government and its handling of the economic situation. But it was really the death of Mahsa Jinnah Amini, an Iranian Kurdish woman who was murdered by the morality police about a month and a half ago, that became the spark that turned these sporadic protests into what I think can only be properly termed at this point a revolution. This has become a feminist uprising, really, more than anything else. And I think that's what has made this particular moment in Iran unique. It's what's made it different than previous mass uprisings that we saw, say, in 2019 or in 2009. Because these are women who have challenged this regime in a way that I think is utterly brand new, right? It's in a way that the regime is not used to actually dealing with. This is weird pixelation. It's supposed to be different. Anyway, it's a PowerPoint instead of Keynote. Mac, you know how that works. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I think for the first time, the legitimacy of this regime has completely fallen apart. When you have young women who are willing to sacrifice themselves for their most basic rights, when you have a movement that has managed now to expand beyond just the sort of traditional confines that we've seen in previous protests, where it's now men and women, it's now old and young, it's liberals, progressives, secularists, but also at the same time, conservatives, religious groups, business interests, a movement that is not just urbanized, it's not just in sort of the big cities anymore, but it has now spread to the majority of the provinces in Iran. Truly, I think at that point, you can begin to understand that this is different than anything else that we have seen. And this is a movement that I think it should be clearly understood is not interested in reform or compromise. This movement is speaking in a singular voice. They want an end to this regime, and they are not going to give an inch until they get that goal. There's a lot to say about this, and I'm sure we'll have a larger conversation. And let's be honest, it's hard to know where exactly this is going to go. There have been many times where we've all been very excited that possibly, maybe, something's going to change in Iran. And the government has always responded with overwhelming violence. And it's doing that again now. Let's be clear about this. Hundreds of people have been killed, thousands have been arrested, and this movement is just getting started. But what I want to say that's very interesting about this is that the roots of what we're seeing in Iran actually go back about 100 years to Iran's very first revolution, the 1906 revolution. About 115 years ago, a young group of sort of politically active, many of them Western-educated young Iranians poured out onto the streets of Iran, and together with business interests and the clerical establishment, began clamoring for a constitution. We call this the Persian or Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1906. Basically, what they wanted was a document, some means that to sort of establish the rights and privileges of all the citizens of the country. And they wanted a parliament. They wanted an elected body who would have the ability not just to pass legislation, but much more importantly, to curb the absolute authority of the Shah, the king of Iran. And, just like we're seeing today, at the forefront of that movement were a group of women who created these councils, these unions, the very first sort of civil rights groups focused on women, to make sure that their demands were also heard in the Constitution. In December of 1906, the Shah, this man right over here with this spectacular mustache named Zafar ad-Din Shah, acquiesced. He signed a constitution, and he allowed for the creation and election of an independent parliament. And for a very brief while, Iran became a constitutional monarchy, the first constitutional monarchy in the Middle East. And as often happens in these kinds of historical moments, just when you thought everything was going well, about 3 days after he signed that constitution, Muzaffar ad-Din died in his bed. And the man who replaced him was his 35-year-old son, Muhammad Ali. Not that Muhammad Ali, different Muhammad Ali Shah, but now at least you'll remember his name. Muhammad Ali Shah was the 35-year-old crown prince. And you have to understand, I mean, you know, we've had some pretty miserable SOBs sit on the throne of Iran, but this guy definitely took the cake. He had basically grown up believing that the throne was his by birthright, that God had made him Shah, and that God had given him Iran as his personal property. And he was incensed. He was absolutely incensed with his father for having allowed these, peasants and these pointy-headed intellectuals to curb that unchecked authority. And from the moment that he came into power in January of 1907, he began first working in the background along with his Russian supporters. The Russian Empire had a very strong foothold in Persia at the time. In fact, in many ways, the entire Persian monarchy was more or less kind of built upon thousands and thousands of rubles in unpayable loans that the Tsar had given to the empire. And so with the help of his head of the Cossack Brigade, this was his Russian-trained, Russian-armed, Russian-commanded military force, a man by the name of Lyakov, and his advisor and tutor, Chapshal Khan, that's that man on the top over there, he began to work behind the scenes to essentially create a counter-movement against the constitutionalists. It took about a year or so, but eventually he managed to turn what was a revolution into a civil war, with one side being royalists who supported the Shah, and the other side nationalists who supported the Constitution. He then used his Russian-trained army to essentially take back almost every part of the country back to the crown. He tore up the Constitution. He rolled his Russian-made cannons to the Parliament building, and then blew up the building with the parliamentarians still inside, actually. They were in the middle of a session when this happened. And again, managed to essentially reclaim control over the whole of the land, except for one city, a city in the northwest of Iran, a city by the name of Tabriz. And Tabriz essentially became the kind of last bastion of the revolutionaries. Everyone gathered there. And under the command of this legendary hero, this legendary commander by the name of Sattar Khan, who many people at the time were referring to as the Persian George Washington, which is weird because, George Washington was like, a rich white slave owner, and he was an illiterate horse thief. But nevertheless, so under Sattar Khan's military command, this kind of massive, very well-trained revolutionary army arose out of the kind of hodgepodge revolutionaries. And much more interestingly, Sattar Khan sent these letters to the capitals of Europe and to North America, essentially asking for assistance in this anti-imperialist revolution. These letters were fascinating because essentially what they were saying was, there's a great line in the letter where it says, if you open the heart of a Japanese man, won't it look like the heart of a Persian? If you open the heart of a British man, won't it look the same? And he makes this incredible appeal where he says, put away the prejudice of nationality. Do away with the bigotry of creeds and give us your attention. this notion that what they were fighting for wasn't just national aspirations, but human aspirations. And it worked. Fighters started pouring into Tabriz from Russia, from Armenia, from Turkey. Georgians joined the fight. There were 2 Jewish commanders in the Revolutionary Army, Buddhists and Baha'is, Christians, both Armenian Christians and Chaldean Christians, and of course Muslims, both Shia and Sunni. And suddenly this revolutionary force became this multi-religious, multinational, multi-ethnic, anti-imperialist force whose sole goal was to defeat the Shah and bring freedom and democracy to Persia, modern-day Iran. And this is kind of where our story starts, because amongst that massive multinational, multi-religious, multi-ethnic coalition was one American. This kid named Howard Baskerville, the subject of the book that Marcy was just talking about. Howard Baskerville was a 22-year-old Christian missionary from North Platte, Nebraska. He was the son and grandson of Presbyterian preachers. And in 1903, he followed his father's footsteps and went to Princeton in order to get a degree in Christian ministry. But while he was at Princeton, he took advantage of this brand new electives system that Princeton had just developed in order to take 2 classes his junior year with the recently promoted president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson. Now, we now understand that Woodrow Wilson was a very complicated man. On the one hand, he had this incredible understanding of freedom and democracy as sort of the divine will. He would give these unbelievably inspiring speeches about how the sort of freedoms that Americans take for granted are universal ideals and they need to be planted in all places of the world. That what God wanted for humanity was the freedom to make their own choices, to be their own people, to live in free societies, that was the divine will. That was essentially what history was moving towards. And it was really the responsibility of not just Americans, but particularly, young, educated, white men of privilege to carry this revolutionary message to the rest of the world. Very inspiring man who ended up more or less creating what we now refer to as international law. He helped win the First World War as President of the United States. He created the League of Nations, which is the forerunner to the United Nations. He was the first globalist, before that was really even a term. He was also an unrepentant racist who, long after the Civil War was over, was an ardent supporter of the Confederate cause. His family owned slaves. As president of Princeton University, he refused to follow the lead of the other Ivy League schools and allow black students to enter the university. And when asked why, his answer was, because it would be embarrassing for them and for us. As president of the United States, he essentially rid the entire federal government of all black employees. He even once screamed "Birth of the Nation" at the White House. He had this vision of the world being free. He just didn't mean for black people. Nevertheless, for someone like Howard Baskerville, who, like Wilson, was, the son of a Presbyterian preacher, like Wilson, was about to essentially shake off the expectations of his family and pursue something different, this relationship was really pivotal in forming his imagination. And so when he graduated the following year from Princeton University, rather than go back home where his family was in South Dakota back then, and take up his expectation as some country pastor at some Presbyterian church somewhere. He decided he wanted to do something a little different. He wanted an adventure. And if you're a 22-year-old white kid, white Christian kid, and you're not rich and you want to see the world, you become a missionary. That's basically your only opportunity, and that's what he does. He applies to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions in order to become a missionary. And when asked where he wanted to go, he says very clearly, he's prayed about it, and he thinks God wants him to go to China or Japan. And then in very small print, as you can see, right up there, he writes, or Persia. Howard Baskerville did not want to go to Persia. In his letters, the letters that he writes to Robert Spear, the head of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, he makes it very clear that he has spoken to Jesus and Jesus wants him in China. And I can't help but think it has partly to do with the fact that he was reading all these missionary reports, right, that were coming out of China and Japan, talking about how glorious the mission was there, how in China hundreds and hundreds of converts are coming to the Bible studies. They don't even have room for them. And in Japan, it's so beautiful. The people are beautiful. The country looks like the British Isles. They are so open to the gospel message. And then he started reading the missionary dispatches from Persia. And they were saying some very, very different things. Unfortunately, again, the transition from Keynote to PowerPoint has cut off some of the writing here, but one of my favorite lines that from the missionary dispatches from Persia comes from a man by the name of Justin Perkins, who had spent decades in Persia preaching the gospel, building schools, building churches and hospitals. And he writes, almost all the sins of the Decalogue are ever present in Persia. And add to those the most abominable sin of Sodom. And this poor kid is reading these things, and Persia, of course, is the last place that he wants to go. But that's not how it works. If you want to be a missionary, you go wherever the church sends you. So they send him to Persia, and of course, they assign him the northwest city of Tabriz. He arrives in Tabriz in the fall of 1907, just around the time that this city is now becoming the center, in fact, the last bastion of this revolutionary movement that's been going on for about 2 years at this point. He's assigned a teaching position at the American Memorial School. He's there to teach English and history, American history. And of course, his primary job is to preach the gospel. And the first thing that immediately happens is that he realizes that everything that he thought Persia was completely wrong. He absolutely falls in love with the country. He falls in love with the people and the culture. He falls in love with the food, which, if you know anything about Persian food, you understand why. I mean, kids from Nebraska, he's eating boiled potatoes, and then suddenly, he's confronted with, if I do say so myself, the best cuisine in the world. He's riding horses, he's boxing, he's playing tennis. He absolutely loves his students love him. He's almost instantly the most popular teacher at the school. He's making friends, and in fact, he becomes very, very close to a fellow professor at the school, a fellow teacher at the school, a man by the name of Hassan Sharifzadeh. Hassan Sharifzadeh also happens to be one of the most compelling orators of the Constitution, this kind of legendary historical figure who had this just innate ability to speak about the Constitution and democracy and Parliament and everything that the nationalists were fighting for in the sort of most beautiful poetic language. He would have hundreds, literally he would stand on a soapbox And hundreds of people would come to him, and he would give these stirring speeches, these stirring orations about what was at stake in this fight. Hassan and Baskerville become best friends. And in a way, Hassan essentially allows Baskerville to kind of come into these circles, right? To start meeting all these fellow revolutionaries, to start learning about what exactly was going on here in Persia. And remember, this is Woodrow Wilson's student. So, he has this moment where he suddenly realizes that he's kind of walked into a history book. He's actually living things that he had only read about in class. And it's an incredibly exciting time for him. But he is repeatedly being told by the school, by the church that sent him there, and certainly by the US government, that whatever is happening in Iran is none of his business. He's there to teach. He is there to preach. He has nothing to do with the politics of the situation. In fact, the US government had made it absolutely clear that they would consider it, and these are the terms that they used, an act of treason for any of these Americans to actually take part in the revolution. Not because the United States had some kind of vested interest in supporting the Shah. To be perfectly frank, the United States had no interest anywhere in the Middle East. I'm not sure if they knew where the Middle East was. This is way before America became entangled in this part of the world. I mean, it was basically, as far as they were concerned, Russia and British lands. But the American government had, in a series of internal memos, made it absolutely clear that this revolution had no hope in succeeding. Why? Because there has never been a successful example of a democratic society in a Muslim-majority state. Islam seems to imply autocracy, the State Department memos wrote. And so because this revolution had no hope of success, the American government could not support it. And because the American government could not support it, no American could have anything to do with it. Well, I'm going to fast forward a little bit in this story, obviously. Baskerville is spending about a year there. He's putting his head down. He's trying his hardest to do what is expected of him, to teach his classes, to preach the gospel, although it's not going that well, actually, to be honest with you, because the kind of gospel that he was preaching wasn't really the kind of message that these Persians were interested in, the kind of gospel that was all about kind of personal salvation and individual choice. That's not really what religion is in Persia, even for Persia's Christians. So he's not having a great time with that part of it, but he's enjoying every other part of it. He does not want to leave Persia. He certainly doesn't want to be kicked out. He certainly doesn't want to be accused of treason. And so he does his best to just put his head down and ignore the situation around him as much as he can, though it's admittedly very, very difficult to do. Fast forward a little bit. Eventually, the Shah's troops make their way to Tabriz. And despite months and months of trying to militarily take the city, this revolutionary force, this multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-national force that Sattar Khan had built in the city repels the Shah's troops over and over and over again. And by the winter of 1909, the Shah decides to change tactics. Rather than try to defeat the city militarily, he just essentially encircles it and creates a blockade, cutting off all food and all water to the city. This is actually an image of the Shah's blockade. They slowly starve the population to death. And what follows is this very incredible and interesting moment in Persian history, a moment that's still taught in schools today, called the Siege of Tabriz. Thousands upon thousands of Tabrizis die. Women, children, men. People begin to sort of go through the orchards picking tufts of grass and alfalfa. They boiled their shoes and their horse saddles in order to survive. But the humanitarian crisis is absolutely devastating. to the point where Baskerville just can't take it anymore. One day he goes to his class and he stands before his students and he just admits that despite all the warnings that he's been given, he cannot ignore the suffering on the streets any longer. He can't just sit idly by and teach these classes. I mean, he is literally teaching a class in the American Revolution, while a revolution is taking place on the other side of the classroom. And the hypocrisy becomes too much. And he tells the students that the only way he knows how to serve them any longer is to quit his job and to go join the revolution. And in a moment that's like really like built for Hollywood, his students get up and join him. And now, I want you to imagine this for a moment. Everybody is freaking out about what's going on right now. The school, obviously, is having a heart attack because it's one thing to have one of their teachers join the revolution, but he took his students with him. I mean, I describe him as kind of like a demented Pied Piper, you know? These were students that the school was supposed to be caring for in the midst of this revolution, and now they're taking up arms alongside their teacher and fighting. The church, as you can imagine, the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions that sent him to Persia in the first place, they're freaking out because they can't, I mean, what if this story gets out? It can't be known that, hey, by the way, one of our missionaries might possibly take up arms against the government where he's assigned. I mean, that is an existential crisis for the Presbyterian mission. And of course, the US government completely freaks out because it is technically, and we can talk about this later, because it is technically true that it is illegal for an American citizen to fight in any foreign nation's army. Yes, I'm sure you're all thinking to yourself, but doesn't that happen all the time now? Yeah, it actually happens all the time now, and it's always illegal. You can't just go and join the IDF. It's actually illegal, despite the fact that thousands of Americans do that. But, so this is the crisis that the school and the church and the State Department is facing. So the American consul in Tabriz basically goes to Baskerville in the middle of this kind of training grounds where they're doing, you know, basic training and preparing for an attack against the Shah's forces. And he says, in no uncertain terms to Baskerville, this is not your fight. These are not your people. This is not your country. You need to desist from these activities right away and come back home. And Baskerville says very famously, the only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth. And that is not a very big difference. And then, in this kind of moment that, you know, there was a lot of ink spilled about, he hands over his passport and gives up his American citizenship and becomes fully a revolutionary. Well, again, just kind of fast forwarding here a little bit, on April 20th, there's no more food left in the city. And Baskerville and his students volunteer to become sort of the tip of the spear in a foolhardy attempt to try to break through the siege. The fight doesn't last very long. Baskerville gets shot in the heart. I believe I have this, yeah, that's his death certificate. He gets shot in the heart. But remarkably, his death galvanizes the revolutionaries. It becomes such an international embarrassment. Not for the Shah couldn't care less, but it becomes an international embarrassment for the Russians who are supporting the Shah, so that the Russians essentially compelled the Shah to declare a temporary ceasefire and allow food and medical assistance into the city of Tabriz. And the revolutionaries used that temporary ceasefire to march on Tehran, to bring the Shah down from his throne and send him into exile, to re-establish the constitution, rebuild the parliament. And the very, very first act of the new parliament is to declare this 24-year-old Christian missionary from Nebraska a national hero in Iran. They refer to him as the American Lafayette. I mean, not as good of a rapper, obviously, but still. And then they also refer to him as Shaheed, a martyr, which, if you know anything about sort of Shia Islam, is a elevated position. What it means is that they recognized him as having sacrificed his life in order not just to bring freedom to Iran, but to save the lives of Iranians. He's buried in a marble tomb in the city of Tabriz. There is actually a golden bust of him in a museum next to that tomb, a museum dedicated to the constitutional revolution. This incredible story, I think, is still very resonant to us, not just because of where we started this conversation. The fact that here we are 115 years later, and there are still people on the streets in Iran still dying for the same rights that Baskerville and his students died for, but also because, to me, Baskerville's memory, his legacy, is a reminder to us all of what we owe one another. I keep thinking about that moment, right? That last moment where they gave him one final chance to stop what he was doing and to just go home. And that notion that here is this kid, you know, a century ago, who understood that the prejudice of nationality, the bigotry of creeds, those things that we use to divide ourselves, to make us different than others, that they're just nothing, right? That they don't actually matter. That fundamentally, the aspiration that we have as human beings makes us the same. And certainly, this is something now that I think is very vital to what is happening in Iran. Part of the reason, I think, why there is such, I think, attention being given to the protesters on the streets isn't just because of how compelling their call is, isn't just because how they are willing to sacrifice themselves, their lives for these most basic rights, the right to have a say in the decisions that rule your life. That's not a big ask, you guys. It's pretty much the most basic of human rights. But I think also what is compelling about it is that we recognize what's being asked. We recognize that aspiration, that desire to actually be heard, to have a say. And my hope is that by bringing Baskerville's legacy back, right, by trying to resurrect his name a little bit, not just here in the United States, but also in Iran, that he can be that kind of bridge that we need right now. Not just between Americans and Iranians, but between all of us as human beings. He's got to be a reminder that the suffering of any one person anywhere is the responsibility of all peoples everywhere. Thank you. I'll stop there, and I'm very excited to have a conversation with you. Marcy, you're going to lead this.
So Robin and Allison will be picking up cards. If you have questions, we'll bring up some chairs.
Oh, yeah, okay, great.
We have very high-tech chairs.
Oh, no, one's got a pen attached to it. Oh.
I know, that's so I can take notes on Sunday. That's my secret.
Then I'll give you the pen chair.
No, you can have the pen chair. You get the fancy chair, yeah. First, I want to give you a little Calvary tote bag. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
I appreciate that. A little shirt in there too.
So you got some swag. Yeah. So while the questions are being collected, I'll start with a few that I had. One of the things that you kind of had to gloss over so that we could, get home on time, is that as the revolution is going on in Tabriz, and the Americans are not really worried for their safety at all. And it's I mean, you don't talk about privilege. I think today we would talk about that as privilege. Americans knew they had this, their name
That's right.
carried before them. And I mean, they did try to hunker down a little bit to stay out of the shelling, but they were safe and they knew it. And at one point, Baskerville kind of reckons with that.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, the Americans had a long presence in Tabriz. The school had been there for, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, but the mission had been there for about 70 years. They had built hospitals, they had built all kinds of schools, they had built, a lot of service projects, and they were a part of the community. But they also understood that as Americans, they were always going to be safe from anything that happens in the city, at all. And as you're right that there is, a couple of moments where there's shelling on the streets and there's, actual open warfare, and the Americans would all get into the school and they would just kind of wait for it to be done and they would leave. And I think Baskerville was really cognizant of the fact that he was a kind of tourist in this revolution, that he could go and hang out with the soldiers and he could, bring them food and he could have these sort of exciting conversations late night, in the sort of smoky coffee shops. But when it came down to it, his passport would always keep him safe. And to me, the sort of most remarkable moment is precisely that moment in which he is given the opportunity to take advantage of that privilege and save his own life. And he chooses not to. And there's a lot of ways in which this story reads like a traditional kind of white savior narrative. I mean, he's a white Christian missionary who went to Iran to convert Muslims to Christianity. It's kind of a literal white savior story, actually. And I really, wrestled with that a lot when I was working on this book. But the more I started learning about him and the more I began to kind of dig into the decisions that he made, the more, and I've made this argument recently in an Atlantic piece, the more it occurred to me that his story is actually the antidote to the white savior story, because the white savior narrative is built upon the idea of a white person of privilege who takes part in small but meaningful acts of charity, and does so, often, in order to have some big emotional experience that ends up just validating his or her privilege anyway, but also does so without really giving any agency to the people that he's there to save. And more importantly, without ever really addressing the underlying issues that result in the crisis that he is trying to address, or recognizing the blame that he himself and his country and his privilege play in the crisis that he is trying to help. But I look at Baskerville's story, and at almost every point, he sort of bursts through that traditional white savior outline. He asks his students very clearly, like, what do you need from me? What is it that I can do to help? And the answer was very clear, that we need you to fight with us. We need an American on our side. We need an American to join us so that the world takes us seriously. He is very clear about the underlying problems here. I want to emphasize something, because we were talking about the other Americans there. It's not like the other American missionaries did not sympathize with the revolution. They absolutely sympathized with it. Their letters back home, their letters to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission, make it very, very clear who is the villain in this story. That the Shah is a murderous tyrant, and that the revolutionaries are fighting for their most basic rights. They are very clear about that. But it's just not their problem, right? Right? That they're there, they could help feed them if they can, they can help, heal their wounds, but they can't do anything about it. And I love the idea that Baskerville in that sort of very important, like recognizing the foundational problem, rather than feeding the population that's starving, wants to put an end to the man who's starving them, right? And he also recognizes the role that his own country and his privilege plays, and is willing to give up that privilege in the end. And, you know, I in a way, I really feel like for, you know, white people of privilege who truly do want to do good in the world, he provides a kind of guideline for how to do that without falling into the white savior trap.
Yeah, that scene where he's, you know, like, oh, there's people out there dying and I'm in here comfortable. I was like, oh, that kind of feels like my life in a lot of ways.
And like all of us, right?
And as a professional Presbyterian, I would read this book and go, oh, I can't, like, really? And then I was like, oh, good job, we did a good, like, it's sort of a hit or miss, you know, how I feel about our response there. But, you know, I will say the Presbyterian mission endeavor today is very different than it was 100 years ago.
I think, yeah.
But, you know, again, I'm sorry. But, you know, we would go over and build hospitals and build schools and, you know, as you mentioned, provide services. And I think all of those things are good on some level, but they were always secondary to the idea of conversion. Yeah. But the education piece kind of kept coming through in this book. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about education and revolution, because at one point he causes one of the American government people to lock up his Encyclopedia Britannicas. And
it's a very funny story.
It's a great story. Can you talk about that?
Well, so look, I mean, Baskerville was a kid. He was very naive. He was passionate. But he frankly didn't know anything about fighting a war or a revolution. He had no military training whatsoever. And so when he first decides that he's going to join this revolution, he at first keeps it very quiet. He doesn't let anyone know. And he starts using this brand new set of Encyclopedia Britannicas that are at the American consulate. And everyone is, you know, he's there for hours and hours at a time, just kind of pouring through this encyclopedia. And everyone assumes that he's, you know, taking notes for his classes or what have you. And only later on do we find out that, no, he's learning about military tactics, bomb-making techniques, you know, drilling. Apparently, all of that is available in the Encyclopedia Britannica, apparently. And so he's using the only source at his disposal to kind of figure out, like, how does one fight? I don't really know how to do this, but I have to learn and figure this out. And he does, when he gets found out, yes, they lock up the encyclopedia.
You know, I mean, I remember when my parents bought our encyclopedias, it was a big deal. And then, like, when we were closing out my parents' house, we're like, what do we do with these? Like, they're not worth anything. But to realize how valuable...
You could fight a revolution.
I know how valuable they were. And even that was, like, to have access, having access to that. And at one point, he was wanting to join, or maybe it was some of the students were wanting to join, and they were told, no, we need you to be educated.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So long before Baskerville made the decision to join, a number of his students actually tried to join the Revolutionary Army. And this is before the siege, when things were going well still. And Sattar Khan says to them, yeah, in no uncertain terms, no, like, we are fighting for you. So go and get educated, and you can build the Iran that we are fighting in order to create. I should mention that by the winter of 1909, when those very same kids go back to Sattar Khan and things aren't going that well, he says, grab a gun, grab a uniform, let's get drilling.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions about what did his family think about it? And one of the questions actually is from Ed Baskerville.
Good, Ed is here. Hi, Ed. Hi, Ed. Nice to see you. Well, it's interesting because by the time the siege begins, and this is before Baskerville joins the revolution, by the time the siege begins, all communication is cut off in the city. So no mail gets in, no mail gets out. And so when he decides to join the revolution, he writes this really beautiful letter to his mother and his family back home, in which he sort of makes it very clear kind of, what he's doing and why he's doing it. He says, that he sounds, the letter is exactly the kind of letter that a son would write his mother in that kind of circumstance, because he sounds very confident. Everything's great. It's fine. We're going to win this thing. There's nothing to worry about. I should mention I joined the revolution. It's all fine. Don't stress. I feel really good about it. I mean, it's zap. There's no winning this thing at that point. And he writes this beautiful letter, basically saying, why he's doing this, and that he's doing it because he feels like this is what his faith demands of him. It's what his identity as an American demands of him. But then he can't send the letter. So he folds it up and he puts it in his pocket. And it's on his corpse when he dies. And the wife of the headmaster of the school, Annie, ends up sending it to his mom after he's dead. Kind of sad.
Yeah.
Story.
And do you know what their response was after, when they...
Not much. So I've had the opportunity to meet with some Baskervilles over the course of this book tour, and I've also had a chance to meet with some Wilsons. The Wilsons ran the school, and it's really interesting how quickly his story just kind of went away. And I don't think that it was by accident. You had mentioned that Presbyterian mission is different today than it was back then. Back then, the Presbyterian mission, recognizing, like I said, the existential crisis that Baskerville's decision to join the revolution represented, very, very quickly cut all ties with him. In fact, when the State Department writes, so the State Department tries to get Baskerville to leave, but he hands over his passport and his American citizenship, so now the State Department has no control over him. He can do whatever he wants to. So in a last-ditch effort, they contact the church, and they basically say, come get your boy.
He's just a teacher.
Yeah,
He's not.
And that's their answer, right. They write back.
We're sneaky, we Presbyterians.
Yeah, they write back a very curt telegram to the State Department that essentially says, well, technically, Baskerville's not really a missionary. He's a teacher at a missionary school, and therefore not our problem. And I quote all these sort of back and forth internal memos at the State Department, where the Secretary of State and the Assistant Secretary of State are basically going like, what does that even mean? What do you mean? What's the difference? You sent him here. Come get him.
Right, you paid for his trip.
You paid for his trip, like he's one of yours. But you can't really blame the mission. They have to stifle this story as quickly as possible, and so does the State Department. And I think after his death, I quote a telegram that the American legate, who is basically the sort of an ambassador when you don't have an actual embassy in Tehran, a man by the name of John Jackson. When Baskerville dies, he writes a telegram to the State Department, and the telegram says, Mr. Baskerville's death has simplified matters.
Considerably, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, we've been stressing about this for weeks, and he's dead. Let's just let it go, and the story will go away, and it did.
Is his name still remembered in Iran today?
I would say it's very hard to find anyone, under the age of 50 in Iran who still knows who Baskerville is. There's really, post the 79 revolution, there was a concerted effort to kind of wipe the collective consciousness clear of him. I read in the book that when I was a kid in Iran, there were schools named Howard Baskerville, streets named Howard Baskerville. In Tehran. I have recently talked to a friend of mine in Iran who says that there is a very popular chain of coffee shops called Baskerville. But I honestly cannot imagine that anyone who, any of the sort of kids who are in those coffee shops sipping lattes have any idea who Baskerville is. I'll tell you one actually funny story. So I was working with a film company in Iran doing some video, and they went to the museum where his bust is. And they had the docent give him a tour while they filmed some things. And when they got to the Baskerville, they couldn't say that they were there to do a video on Baskerville because that would have gotten them in trouble. So they said they were there to do a video on the Constitutional Revolution. And so they were asking the docent all these different questions, and then when they got to the Baskerville wing of the museum, they said, and who is this, by chance? And the docent said, this was, I think he was some American military advisor. And the director of the video said, no. Are you sure? I'm pretty sure he was a missionary. And the docent said, no, that can't be right.
That'd be silly.
And this is the docent. This is the person in charge of the museum. So, yeah, it's quite sad. There's really very little memory of Howard Baskerville left.
I was glad you had a picture of the rug with his face on it. Does that still exist?
It does. It's in the Constitution House.
Museum.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a painting of him, and there's some stuff from the Revolution. I mean, there's, like I said, it's about a wing of the entire museum that's dedicated to this, American missionary who fought and died in this revolution, and even the museum director isn't exactly sure who he is anymore.
Right. Do you think, I guess I've been paying attention to the news differently because I've been reading the book, and so I've been thinking about it. Do you think this revolution now, or this uprising now, is getting, I don't think it's getting that much attention. How do you think the attention it's getting in the media here compares to the revolution of 1909?
Well, that's a very, very good question. The Constitutional Revolution was an international event. It was a big, big deal. I note in the book that at one point Vladimir Lenin writes this big sort of essay, this call to action, saying all revolutionaries in the world should get themselves to Persia, because this is the anti-imperialist struggle of our time. If the Persians can defeat the Shah, then any one of us can defeat our own tyrants and dictators. And even Baskerville joining the revolution became a big story. There were sort of front page articles in the London Independent and the New York Times, headlined "American Defends Tabriz." But it very quickly went away as a story. And I think, I'm looking at the images now, these incredible, compelling images coming from Iran, and it is, right now, it has captured the imaginations of the world. It was 100,000 people in Berlin over the weekend, marching in solidarity with the Iranians. And that's very, very important, because the international attention is the only thing that has the ability to curb the unfettered violence of this regime. But I can't help but think that the minute Ben Affleck does something stupid, that we're all going to stop watching, that we're all going to stop caring. And I really hope that doesn't happen, because I do want to emphasize that although I am calling this a revolution for technical and academic reasons, revolutions are a slog, right? I mean, the revolution of 1979 that my family lived through started in 1977. So this is going to be a very long process, and we have to keep focusing on it. We have to keep our attention on it.
What news organizations give good reporting out of Iran right now?
Out of Iran?
Or about it?
Yeah, if it's out of Iran, you're really relying on citizen journalist groups, individuals who are making sure to document not just the protests, but the abuses of the government, and then getting those out of the country. And so there are a lot of outlets in Europe and the United States that are amplifying those voices, like BBC Persian, Voice of America is doing a really fine job. CNN International has done some very interesting reports from Iran, but honestly, I just don't think that it has really captured the mainstream media's attention in the way that it's captured, I think, the sort of popular attention. I think, we go on Facebook, we go on Instagram, we go on Twitter, and we see these incredible images, and then we turn on CNN, and it's Trump all the time. So I'm hoping that will change, but I'm not really holding my breath.
Right. Yeah. I scrolling through my news feed, sometimes I'm like, why do you think I want to read that article? Like, just don't, you have to go out and I have to go track it down. So,
but it's there.
It's there.
It is available.
There's a couple of questions in here about outside forces, and you talk about this in the epilogue of the book a lot, but about the effect that outside governments, including the CIA, have had in Iran. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. I mean, look, I said that, in 1906, America couldn't find, Persia on a map. But by the 1950s, they certainly knew where Persia was. The CIA, of course, has had a very long, pernicious role in Iranian affairs, beginning with the 1953 coup, the CIA coup in Iran, which there have been three major revolutions in Iran: the 1906 one that we discussed, the 1953 revolution, and the 1979 revolution before this current one. And in the 1953 revolution, the Shah was removed from power and sent into exile, and the CIA quite literally just put him right back on the throne. And ever since then, there has been this, sort of very real sense amongst Iranians, not just sort of regime supporters, that the United States government has, had a role in behind the scenes in Iran, not just up to the days of the Shah, but even with the current Islamic Republic. That is not to say, by the way, that the Iranian people cannot make a distinction between the U.S. government and the American people. They really can. I think anyone who has had an experience in Iran, or anyone who's spoken to Iranians, will tell you that it is the most pro-American population, not just in the Middle East, but maybe anywhere, frankly. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that because the Iranian government is so anti-America, and the Iranian people loathe their government so much that just, by default, they're very pro-American.
Well, Americans must be great then.
Yeah, Americans must be great. I love everything about it. But they are sophisticated to understand the difference between the American people and the American government in a way that I really wish we were.
Yeah.
We're not that good at that.
I had that same realization when I was in Syria. And the Syrians were very clearly not a fan of our government and were the most welcoming of us. And I was like,
I'll tell you, I think it's because, this is just my sort of sense, when you live in a country like Iran, where the government does not represent you, not even remotely, you just assume that that's true everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas when you live in a country like the United States, where the government ostensibly represents you, at least in theory, you just assume that that's kind of the sense everywhere else, right? That there isn't, that the Syrian people are like the Syrian government, or that the Iranian people are like the Iranian government, or the Chinese people are like the Chinese government. And that's rarely true.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the questions in here is about what is the difference in researching a book or the events just happened 100 years ago and you can actually meet somebody who's related to your subject, or writing a book about Jesus, which it goes back a little further. And what's the difference, or God for that matter, going back a little further.
Yeah, going back further than that. To be perfectly honest, in this particular case, not that much. I mean, I've always known the story of Howard Baskerville. I kind of grew up knowing that story. But what I knew about Baskerville, and what has, until this point, been written about him, could maybe fill a small pamphlet, possibly. And in a sense, I had the same challenge with Baskerville's story as I had with Jesus' story, which is, you know a little bit about the person, you can kind of get to some of the historical aspects of the person, but you know a lot about the world in which they moved. And so it's about taking that little bit and combining it into that world so that the person becomes real, that their actions start to make sense, that motivations start becoming clearer. In fact, I've said this before, the experience of writing this book, the emotions, the tone, the just kind of the feeling of it, reminded me a lot of the feeling of writing Zealot. I mean, they're both stories about young, charismatic, idealistic, individuals who, when confronted with an intolerable situation, use their faith to activate against it. Kind of feels the same, I gotta be honest with you.
Right, yeah. There's definitely a sense of the Presbyterian missionaries saying, like, no, we don't get involved in political things. We just take care of people's souls. As if, like, that matters when you're starving to death. And I thought, well, interfered when a daughter or donkey has been stolen. We have interfered when a church or a fence had to be built. We have interfered when a man was to be buried or married. We have interfered in the behalf of the oppressions of the rich and the poor. We have interfered in time of war and in time of peace. In fact, there is no time or occasion in which we have not had our say in the administration of this people.
Yeah,
and
it's true.
Yeah, and but it made me think. I think often we think we can maybe keep our faith neatly buttoned up and then go out in the rest of our world and not be affected. And I was wondering, like, what would have happened in the history of the Presbyterian Church had we supported Baskerville and not in that timeline, like, what would we have become?
It's an interesting thought. It's funny because what the mission was basically saying was exactly as you're saying, that separate religion from politics, separate the spiritual from the civil. You're there to save souls, not lives. And one of the things that I talk about is how spectacularly unsuccessful the missionaries actually were in converting anyone.
Yeah.
They built amazing hospitals, they built amazing schools, they educated the population, they cared for the population. But insofar as actually converting Muslims to Christianity, they were not that successful.
Terrible. Right.
And part of the reason is because that idea of religion that they came from America to Persia with, this idea that religion is an individual thing, it's just about you and God and your personal salvation, and made no sense at all to Persians. It didn't make any sense to Persia's Christians. They didn't understand that concept of religion. Persia, like most places in the world, is a place in which religion is your identity. It's like your communal identity, right? It's not just this kind of individual choice that you've made. It's not about the soul. It's not separate from the world. It is the world. And so, Baskerville is sitting there, preaching the gospel and talking about, what Jesus wants of your eternal soul. And I think people were saying, my eternal soul, I'm dying for my basic freedoms right now. Well, what would Jesus do about that?
My eternal soul is hungry. I
Yeah.
want some bread.
Right.
Right, yeah. One last thought, that you want to send us out with, you've written about him. We're all going to read the book. If you haven't,
let me make my last thought not about Baskerville, but about Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of mentioned this a little bit before about how important it is that we pay attention. And I just want to drive home what that actually means. I think we have to understand that a tyrant thrives in the darkness, right? That authoritarian states survive because they cut off access that their people have to the rest of the world, right? Right now, the Iranian government is trying to convince the people on the streets that what they're doing is hopeless, that there's no end point to this, they're sacrificing themselves for a thing that they're never going to get. So just go home. And that the rest of the world doesn't really see them. The rest of the world doesn't care, that no one is watching, that at any moment they can do what they did in 2019, for example, which is to just turn off the lights and kill everybody. And I think what we need to make sure that government hears as loudly and as clearly as possible is that we do hear the voice of these protesters. We do see them, that we're not going to look away, that we're going to continue to shine a light upon them, that we will continue to elevate their voices. When you ask protesters on the streets, what do you need from us? Not from our governments. What do you need from us as human beings? To a person, they say, pay attention. That's what we need. We need you to pay attention, because the minute you stop paying attention, they'll just kill us all. And it sounds like a small thing. It sounds like, literally the least that we could do is pay attention. But I can't emphasize to you how vital and how powerful our attention actually is to literally keeping these protesters alive. So that's I guess what I would like to sort of leave everyone with is, please don't look away. Please don't stop paying attention. Your tweets matter. Your Facebook posts matter. Your Instagram posts, they matter.
Great. I'm sorry, we didn't quite get through all of the questions, but thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you again. And we hope to see you in December. Thanks, everybody.